The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dry, cracked earth of the Andrews Ranch. It was a heat that usually brought life, that swelled the corn and promised sustenance. But this morning, the air was heavy, charged not with promise, but with a silent threat that had arrived on horseback. General Elias Reed of the Mexican Army, a man whose reputation was as tough as his saddle leather, faced Caleb Andrews with a contempt that could freeze hell over. His eyes, small and dark, saw not a farmer, not a father, but merely an obstacle, an insect to be crushed beneath the boot of authority. Between them, kneeling in the dust, was little Thomas Andrews, 8 years old. The general's hand was clamped firmly in the boy's blond hair, yanking his head back with a cruel, unnecessary force. Thomas's silent tears streaked the dirt on his face, but he made no sound. His father had taught him to be strong. Caleb felt his blood boil, every muscle in his body screaming to lunge, to rip his son from that unholy grip. But he knew what would happen. The 5 soldiers flanking the general had their rifles at the ready, their faces impassive, mere instruments of their commander's will. "I asked for the last time, settler." Reed's voice was a low, controlled growl. "Where does your loyalty lie? To this tattered rag with a lone star? Or to the republic that gave you this land?" He shook Thomas's head, and a sob escaped the boy's lips. Caleb's heart splintered into 1,000 pieces. Loyalty? What a bitter irony! His loyalty was there, kneeling in the dust, looking at him with eyes that pleaded for help. His loyalty was buried beneath the old oak, where his father, a veteran of San Jacinto, rested in peace. He and his family had spilled blood for this patch of ground, not to see it desecrated by a uniformed tyrant. "My loyalty is to this land and to my family," Caleb replied, his voice steady, though his insides were dissolving. "Not to men who use children as shields." A crooked smile formed on Reed's lips. He relished this. He relished breaking men's spirits, watching them choose between honor and survival. To him, they were the same thing, submission. He released Thomas's hair with a shove, sending the boy sprawling face first into the dust. "The land belongs to he who has the power to keep it," the general said, dismounting with calculated agility. "And your family, your progeny, will survive only if they learn to bow." Caleb recalled, in a painful flash, the conversations he'd had with his late wife, Martha. She had warned him months before, when Reed's first detachments arrived in the valley. She had felt the shift in the wind. "They aren't like the others, Caleb," she'd said one night, as she mended one of Thomas's shirts. "These men don't bring law, they bring fear." He, in turn, had tried to calm her, driven by a stubborn faith in common sense, in the order of things. "They are soldiers, Martha, just following orders. Texas is free, they know that." What a fool he'd been. Freedom wasn't a permanent state. It was a daily fight, and he had let his guard down believing in papers and promises, while the real danger wore a uniform and rode to his doorstep. Reed walked slowly to the porch of Caleb's simple yet dignified home. He ran a gloved finger along the wooden railing, then looked at his fingertip as if he'd touched something unclean. "Fine horse," he said, nodding towards the stable where Spark, the sorrel stallion Thomas, loved more than anything, whinnied nervously. "A fair tax for your stubbornness. My men will take him." Caleb took a step forward, instinct overriding reason. "No, that horse belongs to my son." Reed laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Now he belongs to the Mexican Army. Consider it a reminder. Next time I come to collect your loyalty, the price will be higher." The soldiers moved, one of them entering the stable and emerging with Spark, who resisted, frightened. Thomas got to his feet. his face streaked with dirt and tears, and ran to his father, clinging to his leg. The boy watched his horse being led away, his body trembling in silent sobs. Caleb knelt, embracing his son tightly, the smell of dust and fear clinging to his clothes. He didn't look at Reed. He wouldn't give him that satisfaction. He focused on the tremor of his son's body, on the injustice burning in his chest like a live ember. The general mounted his horse, satisfied. The work was done. The seed of fear had been planted. He and his men turned and rode away, leaving behind a trail of dust and a heavy silence, broken only by the stifled cries of a child. Caleb remained there, kneeling for a long time, feeling the weight of that moment crush him. He had failed. He had failed his son, the memory of his wife, his father's legacy. In that instant, he felt like the weakest man in Texas. What he didn't know, what General Reed could never imagine, was that the scene had had more than 2 witnesses. Across the road, partially hidden by the wooden structure of an old farm gate, a solitary figure watched it all. The man was still as motionless as a granite statue, mounted on a horse as imposing as himself. The morning sun glinted off the barrel of his long rifle, which rested familiarly in his arms. He didn't move, made no sound. He just watched the dust settle, his gaze fixed on the violated ranch, his jaw clenched. If you believe a general's power is absolute, wait until you see what happens when a Texan's honor is wounded. Because as Elias Reed rode away triumphant, the hot desert wind seemed to carry a distant sound, an echo of past battles, and a whispered name that would soon make all tremble again. Crockett. The humiliation, Caleb discovered, had a bitter taste of dust and helplessness. In the days that followed, General Reed's act spread through the community like wildfire. But instead of solidarity, Caleb found suspicion. Reed was cunning. He hadn't just stolen a horse, he'd stolen a man's reputation. His soldiers had spread the story, but with a poisonous twist. Caleb Andrews, they said, had tried to negotiate with the general, offering information in exchange for safety. He had been challenged to prove his loyalty and had failed, making him a pariah in the Army's eyes. The lie was so absurd, it should have died at birth. But fear is fertile ground for slander. When Caleb went to the town of San Felipe to buy supplies, neighbors who once greeted him with a tip of their hats now looked away. Conversation ceased when he entered the general store. The blacksmith, a man with whom he'd shared beer and stories, was suddenly too busy to fix his wagon wheel. He was marked, isolated. Every sideways glance was a new blow, more painful than the slap he'd received from the general. He wasn't just a victim. He had been transformed into a traitor in the eyes of his own people. Meanwhile, General Reed reveled in his small victory. He established his headquarters at the old mission on the outskirts of town, turning the sacred place into a symbol of his authority. From there, he ruled with an iron fist. He organized an extravagant party using cattle and grain confiscated from local ranchers as proof of his generosity and power. The sound of music and laughter from his officers echoed through the night, a direct affront to the families struggling to put food on the table. Caleb heard the sound from his farm just a few miles away, and every musical note seemed like a mockery. The general was a predator who not only devoured his prey but boasted of the deed. He was the embodiment of arrogance, a man so sure of his impunity that he didn't bother to hide his abuses. He displayed them like medals. Caleb's situation worsened. With his reputation tarnished, no one wanted to buy his produce. The corn he had harvested with so much effort began to rot in the barn. Money was running out. the promise he had made to Martha on her deathbed that Thomas would never go without, now seemed like a cruel joke. He sat on the porch every night, watching his son sleep, and guilt consumed him. One night, as despair choked him, he remembered a story his father had told him when he was a child. It was about Davy Crockett, not at the Alamo, not with a rifle in hand, but during his days in Congress. His father spoke of how Crockett could disarm the most arrogant politicians, not with threats, but with a keen observation and a well-told story. He didn't look at what a man said. "Caleb," his father had said, his gaze lost in the fire. He looked at what the man loved and what he feared. A man's pride is often the rope that will hang him. That memory, dormant for years, awakened something in Caleb. He had spent days stewing in his anger, his humiliation. Now, for the first time, he began to think. He stopped looking at his own pain and started looking at his enemy. He began to observe. Every day, he rode to a vantage point in the hills from which he could see the mission. Without being seen, he watched General Reed's routine. The general was a creature of habit. He woke at the same hour, inspected his troops with the same air of superiority, and most importantly, every Tuesday at noon, a single messenger arrived from Goliad, bringing dispatches from General Koss. The messenger was always received personally by Reed, who took him to his private room. There was an urgency, an importance to this weekly meeting that stood out from the garrison's monotonous routine. It was a pattern, a weakness. Caleb didn't know what was in those correspondences, but he knew they were vital to Reed. The general's pride was in his career, in his image before his superiors. Those letters were his lifeline, his link to the power he so idolized. The seed of an idea, dangerous and uncertain, began to sprout in Caleb's mind. He didn't have an army. He didn't have the reputation of a hero. All he had was knowledge of this land, the pain of a broken promise, and the memory of an old story about bringing down giants. He didn't need a rifle to fight this battle. He needed something sharper, his enemy's vanity. That night, for the first time in weeks, Caleb didn't feel like a victim. He felt like a hunter. He looked at the illuminated mission in the distance, not with fear, but with cold, calculated focus. The general had stomped onto his ranch to teach him a lesson about power. Now, Caleb would teach him a lesson about Texas. Every humiliation he had suffered had planted something new within him, something that grew stronger than fear, more resilient than despair. The general didn't know it, but in trying to break that farmer, he had just forged the instrument of his own ruin. The decision transformed Caleb. Despair gave way to a chilling clarity. He wasn't a soldier nor a politician. He was a man of the land, and the land had taught him patience, the right time to plant and the right time to harvest. Now, it was time to prepare the soil for Elias Reed's downfall. His first step was to sell the last milk cow he had left. He did this discreetly in a neighboring town where his reputation didn't precede him. The money wasn't for food or seeds. It was to buy the most valuable tool of all, information. With a few silver coins, he convinced a young, embittered stable hand at the garrison to tell him about the route of the messenger from Goliad. The lad, tired of being mistreated by the soldiers, described the path in detail. The creek crossing, the shortcut through the ravine of oaks, the precise timings. Caleb's plan wasn't a violent ambush. That would only make him a criminal and prove Reed right about him. He needed something more subtle, something that would turn the general's strength against him. And for that, he needed an ally. His instinct led him to a small tavern on the outskirts of San Felipe, a place frequented more by travelers than locals. The place was run by Eliza Douglas, a widow whose face bore the history of a profound loss. Her husband, a Texas Ranger, had been captured and executed under Reed's orders a year prior, accused of espionage. Eliza carried on with the tavern, serving drinks to everyone, including Reed's soldiers, with a cool courtesy that barely hid the fire of hatred in her eyes. She was a woman living in the heart of enemy territory, hearing everything, seeing everything, waiting. Caleb sat at a table in the dark corner and waited for the place to empty. When only the two of them remained, he spoke. He didn't tell her his plan, only about the humiliation, about his son, and about the messenger. Eliza listened in silence, her eyes fixed on him, assessing him. She had already heard the soldier's version of his story, but what she saw before her was not a traitor, but a broken man being remade by righteous anger. "What do you want, Andrews?" she asked, her voice low. "Reed is expecting an important dispatch next Tuesday," Caleb replied. "One he believes will secure his promotion. It talks about troop movements and supposed Comanche attacks. He brags about it to his lieutenants when he drinks." Eliza's ears were her weapon. She confirmed what Caleb suspected. Ambition was Reed's Achilles heel. "Even if you get the letter," she said, skeptical, "what will you do? You can't fight him." "I won't fight," Caleb said. "I'll make him defeat himself." And then he shared the core of his idea. Intercept the message and exchange it for a fake, one that would exploit Reed's arrogance and paranoia, leading him to make a fatal mistake. The problem, and Eliza pointed it out immediately, was the execution. The letter would need General Coss's official seal, and the handwriting would have to be perfect. "You're a farmer, not a forger," she stated. "I'm not," Caleb agreed, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine hope appeared in his eyes. "But I know the stories, the same ones my father told. They say the man who best understands the soul of a Texan is hunting in the woods, north of the Brazos River. A man who knows that sometimes the pen is mightier than the rifle. They say he can imitate any signature after seeing it just once." Eliza stared at him, comprehension dawning on her face. There was only one man in Texas whose legend included both deadly aim and political cunning. Caleb wasn't planning a simple revenge. He was seeking a legend. That night, he left his son Thomas in Eliza's reluctant but secure care. He gave the boy a tight hug, promising to return soon and bring Spark with him. Thomas, with the unwavering faith of a child, believed. With a horse lent by Eliza and a piece of bread in his saddlebag, Caleb rode north. He wasn't going after the messenger. He was going after the only person who could turn a fake letter into an irrefutable decree. The soldiers at the garrison noticed his absence in the following days and laughed, assuming the cowardly farmer had finally fled. They informed General Reed, who smiled with satisfaction. Let him run. It was just more proof of the Texan spirit's weakness. Little did they know that, as they laughed in their fortress of arrogance, Caleb Andrews' silence was merely the prelude to the storm. He wasn't fleeing danger. He was riding straight into the path of the only force of nature a general like Reed could never foresee. Tuesday arrived with a sky of crisp blue and a sun that seemed to mock the tension hanging over the garrison. General Elias Reed was impatient. He paced his office, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor marking a nervous rhythm. The messenger from Goliad was late, and Reed, a man obsessed with order and punctuality, felt his authority challenged by the simple ticking of the clock. His promotion, his future, all depended on the orders contained within that envelope. Finally, the sound of a galloping horse announced the arrival. The messenger, a young, pale, dust-covered soldier, practically fell from his saddle. He looked shaken, as if he'd seen a ghost on the road. "What happened to you, soldier?" Reed growled, snatching the sealed envelope from his trembling hand. I was stopped, my general," the boy stammered. A big man with a coonskin cap. He just looked at me and then sent me on my way." Reed dismissed the story as the delirium of a coward frightened by his own shadow. A settler with a ridiculous hat. Pathetic. He tore open the seal, and his eyes devoured the contents of the letter. The messenger's paleness instantly transferred to the general's face. The orders, written in the unmistakable handwriting of General Koss, were shocking and urgent. Intelligence reported a massive alliance of Comanche tribes forming to the west, ready to attack the settlements. The San Felipe garrison was the only force close enough to intercept them. The order was clear: march with your full strength immediately to Buffalo Pass, a remote location 2 days' ride away, and establish a defensive line. The letter ended with a personal note that made Reed's blood run cold. "Your swift and decisive response to this threat will be closely observed. Success will guarantee the promotion you so desire. Failure is unthinkable." Reed's ego and ambition, the two forces that drove him, collided with paranoia. Disobeying a direct order was the end of his career. Questioning it would take time, and the letter emphasized urgency. Swallowed by his own arrogance, he didn't see the trap. He saw only the opportunity to become a hero. In less than an hour, the garrison was in an uproar. Under Reed's shouts, the soldiers prepared provisions and ammunition, cursing the haste and the invisible enemy. He left behind only a dozen men, most of them inexperienced recruits, to guard the fort. At sunset, the long column of soldiers marched out of town, kicking up a cloud of dust that symbolized the departure of power and order. The dust had barely settled when two figures emerged on the road, riding calmly towards the now undefended town. One was Caleb Andrews, his face etched with determination. The other was a man who needed no introduction, Davy Crockett, with his rifle Old Betsy resting on his saddle and a gaze that held the wisdom of the forests and the strength of the mountains, rode as if he owned that horizon. It was he who had intercepted the messenger, not with violence, but with the force of his legendary presence. The young soldier, upon seeing who stood before him, handed over the letter without hesitation. And it was Crockett's steady hand that, by the light of a campfire the previous night, replicated General Koss's signature with a perfection that would fool the devil himself. They didn't go to the fort. They went to the town square. Eliza Douglas had already gathered the ranchers and citizens. The fear that had paralyzed them for weeks had dissipated, replaced by a spark of hope. Caleb climbed the steps of the general's store. In his hands, he held the original letter from General Koss, which the real messenger, now an ally, had given him. "For weeks, General Reed has called us traitors and cowards," Caleb's voice echoed across the silent square. "He has stolen from us and humiliated us, all in the name of order." He paused, holding up the letter. "This is the true order he should have received. It does not speak of Comanches. It speaks of an investigation into missing Army funds, funds that General Reed has embezzled for his own pocket." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Crockett, leaning against a pillar, watched with a slight smile. He didn't need to speak. His presence was the validation of Caleb's words. Justice was being served, not through a shootout, but through the revelation of truth. The news of Reed's march and the truth behind it spread like lightning. 2 days later, the general's exhausted and frustrated column returned, having found no sign of Comanche warfare. What they found was worse. The town of San Felipe had been transformed. The citizens, now armed and united, guarded the streets. The fort's gate was open, and inside, Davy Crockett sat in Reed's chair, his feet on the table, cleaning old Betsy. Reed, livid with rage, tried to give orders, but his men hesitated. They looked at their demoralized general, at the proof of his corruption in Caleb's hands, and at the living legend who regarded them with a look of disappointment. Their loyalty, built on fear, dissolved. The general, who had arrived as a conqueror, now stood alone, surrounded not by enemies, but by his own silent accusatory soldiers. When the townsfolk gathered and saw the unarmed and defeated general, no one applauded or jeered. They simply tipped their hats, not to him, but in respect for the quiet farmer who, without firing a single shot, had restored dignity to that land. The peace that followed General Reed's downfall was deeper than mere absence of conflict. It was a hard-won peace, felt in the lighter air, in the smiles that returned to neighbors' faces, and in the way men now greeted each other with a renewed sense of brotherhood. Elias Reed was stripped of his uniform and sword in the public square, not by Crockett, but by a detachment of Mexican officers sent from Goliad, who arrived to investigate the chaos and found irrefutable evidence of the general's corruption. His defeat was not on the battlefield, but in a makeshift court, under the gaze of all he had oppressed. He was sent back not as a warrior, but as a common criminal. His career and his pride in ruins. His name, which once inspired fear, quickly became a forgotten footnote in the region's history. He would not be remembered as a tyrant, but as a fool who underestimated a farmer. Caleb Andrews returned to his ranch. His son's horse, Spark, was found and returned, and the sight of Thomas riding through the open fields was the sweetest reward Caleb could have wished for. He sought no recognition or power. He rejected the offer to become the town's new magistrate. His battle was not for glory, but for something far more fundamental: the right to raise his son in peace on the land his ancestors had sanctified with sweat and blood. He rebuilt his life brick by brick. His neighbors, ashamed of their previous distrust, now sought him out for advice, seeing in him not a war hero, but a symbol of resilience and wisdom. The justice he achieved was not merely personal. It healed the community, reminding everyone that the strength of Texas lay not in generals or armies, but in the quiet courage of its people. Before leaving, Davy Crockett spent one last afternoon on Caleb's porch. They drank hot coffee and watched the sunset, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. For a long time, they said nothing. The silence was comfortable, an understanding between two men who, though vastly different, shared a deep love for that wild, untamed land. "Did you never consider just shooting him?" Caleb asked quietly, breaking the silence. Crockett gave a small smile, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Shooting a man like Reed would have been too easy, son. It would have given him a soldier's death," he replied, his voice deep like distant thunder. "What you did was worse. You let him live, but you took away everything that mattered to him: his name, his status, the fear he inspired. You left him with only the truth of who he truly was. In Texas, true revenge isn't killing your enemy. It's living free while he lives forever, trapped in his own failure." With those words, Crockett rose, shook Caleb's hand, and departed, disappearing into the landscape like the legend he was. He needed no thanks. The sight of the Texas flag flying freely over the town was enough. Years later, Thomas, now a young man, would ask his father about those days. Caleb would take him to the old oak where his grandfather was buried and tell him the story. Not a story of a great hero, but the story of a father who refused to bow, of a community that relearned to trust, and of how intelligence and honor can disarm the mightiest army. The lesson was clear, woven into the very soul of Texas. Freedom is not given, it is defended, and those who fight for it with faith, courage, and a just heart are never truly defeated. The powerful called Caleb a fool. The people called him a hero, but he knew the truth, a simple, profound truth that the Texas wind seemed to whisper every night. Courage needs no witnesses to exist, only a cause worth fighting for. If you were moved by this story of honor, cunning, and the indomitable Texan spirit, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any narratives like this. Share it with those who, like us, believe in the strength of the men and women who built nations with courage and faith. And don't forget to comment from which city or country you are watching. We want to know how far the pride in these tales of bravery can reach.